All right. So last week we talked about Jevoah Rapha, the Lord our healer. We talked about the scripture in Exodus chapter 15 where this name first appears in the Bible. It occurs shortly after what I consider one of the greatest and well-known miracles in the Old Testament, the parting of the Red Sea. 3 days roaming the desert without water, the Israelites came to a spring which was named Marah because the water was bitter and undrinkable. We compared this water to drinking a glass of nice warm vinegar on a hot summer day. Yummy. So the Israelites grumbled. They complained to Moses, asking, "What do we do in this situation?" Moses then prayed to God. He revealed a piece of wood next to the spring, which once threw in and miraculously changed the water to drinkable. So we talked further that this was God testing the Israelites faith, and what I believe was to show their short-term memory loss. Because 3 days ago was the parting of the Red Sea. They were singing songs, they were praising God for everything that he did, and then they were grumbling against him in the desert, thinking that he just forsook them. God was reminding them that they need to focus on him, and he'll see them through. The main scripture was Exodus 15:26. And it said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on any of the diseases I brought on to the Egyptians. For I am the Lord who heals you," Jevoah Rapha. So we talked about Egypt being the world's superpower, with all their technology, with all their riches, with all their splendor. And God brought them to their knees. God is telling the Israelites that he has something better for them. If they rely on him, if they listen to him, if they focus on him, he'll be the God that heals their nation. He'll be the God that restores their nation. Just like he did with that bitter water at Marah, he can take out their impurity. He can take out their contamination. He can take out their corruption, cleanse them, make them pure, and make them something better than what Egypt is. Then we talked about Jevoah Rapha last week in the flesh, aka Jesus Christ, and the miracles and the healing that he did throughout his ministry. He gave us glimpses of heaven's perfect kingdom right here on earth as he healed and he restored people throughout the land. We gave an example of 2 of his healings that we found in Luke chapter 8. It was with the woman with the issue of blood and the healing of the 12-year-old daughter of Jairus. We said that we need to make sure that we remain focused on Jesus no matter what happens, no matter the circumstances, no matter the distractions out there. The woman with the issue of blood pushed her way through a crowd of people to touch the edge of Jesus' cloak, even though she was denounced as unclean and should not have been in that crowd in the first place. Jairus did not forget who Jesus was, nor what he could do for his daughter, even though she passed at that time. The other people around Jairus didn't recognize it. They laughed at him, but that was until Jesus raised his daughter from the dead. So when we're going through these ordeals, we need to have that same kind of focus, that same kind of trust, and that same kind of faith in Jesus as Jairus and as that woman with the issue of blood. We can't have that short-term memory loss, and we have to remember what he brought us through up to that point, not what have you done for me lately, God. Instead, we need to continue to seek after him. We need to continue to recognize him, and we need to continue to praise him. Now, this is something that's easy to say, but not easy to do, right? It's especially easy to say when everything's going right. When everything's wrong, it's not. Sometimes our wounds can run very, very deep. Physical ailments, they can continue to plague us no matter what our persistent prayer is, no matter what our plea to take that away. Sometimes our wounds are mental. When we fight battles that people just can't see. It could be mental health, it could be depression, it could be anxiety, it could be panic attacks, it could be phobias. Sometimes our wounds are emotional as well, such as unforgiveness, such as anger, such as even suicidal thoughts or dependency on substances. When you're in the heat of the battle, it's easy to focus or dwell on your problem and ask, where is God? But God's right there. God's right there with you through it all. He's waiting and he's wanting to restore you. His name is Jevoah Rapha, the Lord that heals us. So let's talk about this a little bit more in depth, right? Let's start with talking about the physical element. There was a man that was seeking after healing for a very long time. We find this in the Gospel of John, chapter 5. tells us the story of a paralytic man that was sitting in a place known as the pools of Bethesda. So a little background on this before we dive into the scripture. We know this period where Jesus lived, the Greek culture had a huge influence on society. Greek was the trade language, it was the center of culture, and even in the middle of Jerusalem, you cannot escape the Greek influence. The Greeks created many, many gods. But one in particular that we're looking at today is called Asclepius, who was the pagan god of healing and medicine. And he had a cult following. They would make healing centers all throughout the empire. And they believed if you laid down your mat and you slept near these healing centers, Asclepius's snakes, they would come to you in your dreams, and they would tell you how to heal and how to cure yourself. After a while, they started to make these temples near springs and near pools. And their healing centers started to revolve around them. They would believe that either Asclepius himself or the serpents would go in there and stir the waters of the pool, and that would have healing properties. So when they were sitting next to the pool of Bethesda and that spring started bubbling up, everybody would start to rush into that spring to try to get to that middle to try to be healed. So we see this healing center in the north end of Jerusalem. This was a huge area that had a lot of people in it, and they were all trying to fight to get to that center of the pool. And this is where Jesus meets the paralytic man. We'll pick this up in John 5, 1 through 9. Someone want to read?
Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethesda, in which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades?
Yep.
What is that?
It's like giant tents.
Oh, okay. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, and the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. While I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." At once, the man was cured. He picked up his mat and walked. The day on which this took place was a Sabbath.
38 years, this man was an invalid. Almost 4 decades, this man had been disabled. He's been crippled. He wouldn't been able to make a living for himself. There wasn't social security, there wasn't disability, there wasn't welfare at this time. More than likely, his home was his mat that he was laying on. More than likely, he had to beg and rely on charity for food to be able to sustain himself. This Jewish man was in the middle of this pagan healing area looking for answers in a pagan god. This should show you the level of desperation that this man had. Is because he was forsaking his heritage, he was forsaking his Jewish identity, and he was trying to find this cure so desperately for his paralysis. How do we know this man was Jewish? Because after that, the verses tell us that after he was healed by Jesus, he was questioned by the Pharisees for doing the thing that Jesus told him to do. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk. Because doing work like that takes a lot of effort, carrying a mat, was against the law of the Sabbath, because that was a day of rest. The Pharisees were not focused on the fact that a man who has been suffering for almost 40 years is now relieved and walking. They were focused on the nuances of breaking the rules. So it's kind of funny how we can miss the big picture of what God's doing. But they weren't the only ones in danger of missing this miracle, right? In verse 6, Jesus asked the paralytic man if he wants to get well. The original Greek language of this in the New Testament that's written in, the word Jesus uses here, we translate the well, but its meaning goes deeper than that. Jesus is asking him, do you want to be made whole? Do you want to be restored? Do you want to be returned to normal again? Jesus is basically asking this man, do you want your life back? The man says, yeah, Jesus, I do, but I need to get into that pool. I can't get into that pool at the time. Everyone beats me to that pool. Please help me to get into that pool. The man is so focused on his desperation, but Or better yet, he's focused on what he can do about it. What he can do about it isn't enough. What he can do about it has never been enough. It hasn't been enough for a very long time.
He's too focused on what he perceives to be the answer.
Right.
To see the other options.
Yeah. And the option is standing right there. Because Jesus tells him, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. In faith, he listens to Jesus and he follows his instruction. And instantly, he's cured of his paralysis. He can get up. He can pick up his mat. He can walk. Probably to the amazement of himself and certainly to the amazement of everybody there. Think about the look of the other people's faces that were elbowing and pushing him out of the way to get into the middle of that pool. Desperately chasing after the cure for that, but this man didn't even have to dip his toe into that water. He just had to have that visit of Jesus to be healed. I picked that story because it shows us that it doesn't necessarily always happen in our timing or according to our plan, right? I'm sure there's many times where this man woke up and said, man, today is the day that I get into that middle of the pool. You know, I'm sure he came up with different angles, different plans to be able to make it, but everyone still beat him to the center of that. Likewise, I'm sure there's days he woke up defeated and said, I am never going to get healed. I'm never going to do this. But still he remained there. Still he tried. Still he continued to get into that pool. I'm sure this man spent a lot of time hoping and reflecting and praying and begging and pleading for this paralysis to be taken away. And maybe we're dealing with the physical element in that same way. You know, maybe we've been born with it. Maybe we've been dealing with it for a very long time, just like me, in my case, with spina bifida. But maybe it's something recent. Maybe it's an injury. Maybe it's a condition. Maybe it's a tumor. But in any case, our plan can't just be sitting there at the edge of the pool. If we're only focused on what we can do about it, we're going to miss it. Our plan has to be looking for and waiting for Jesus because he has that power to heal and restore us one day. It may be in this life, it may be in the next one, but I promise you that he's going to one day tell us to get up, pick up that mat, and walk, and we will. And I promise you we will. 1 Corinthians 15, 42 through 44. The Apostle Paul tells us, so will it be with the resurrection of the dead. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor. It is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness. It is raised in power. It is sown a natural body. It is raised a spiritual body. If there is a natural body, there is a spiritual body. Our flesh, it's imperfect. It's corrupted. It's weak. Sometimes God will grant us a peace and a mercy right now to help us with those imperfections here on earth to his glory. But one day, we are going to be in his glory and his presence, and we will be raised to those perfect spiritual bodies. I don't know exactly what that looks like, but it's in his word. And I know it's true. And I know if we focus on him, we're going to understand that mystery one day. The paralytic man got to experience that slice of healing and restoration here on earth for the witness of everybody in the pool. But now sometimes what troubles us isn't something people can see, right? Sometimes what troubles us isn't on the outside. Sometimes our battles are internal. These battles that I'm talking about are the mental ones. People can be born blind. They can be born deaf. They can be born with physical defects. But people can also be born with chemical imbalances in the brain as well. This is a result of simply living on this side of the heaven. This is a result of living in a fallen state of this world. The good news is that we're not forsaken in this. God is there for us, and God doesn't look just to make our bodies better and whole and restored again. He's also looking to try to renew and refresh our minds as well. But when you're in that mental battle, when you're in mental illness, it can look very scary. It doesn't discriminate. It can affect anybody. When I thought about this subject of mental illness and how God can restore us from this state, I thought about a very extreme case that's found in the Bible. I was reminded of Daniel chapter 4. This is where God struck King Nebuchadnezzar for 7 years with insanity to humble him. But it also talks about how God restored him and how he got a better understanding of the Lord and better appreciation for the Lord. It wasn't too long ago when we talked about the prophet Jeremiah and the prophet Ezekiel and about the exile of the Jewish people. where the nation of Babylon came in and just conquered the land of Israel. The leader of Babylon at that time was King Nebuchadnezzar. And just like many men in power, he let that power go to his head. He was a bit of what I would like to think as an egomaniac. In chapter 2 of Daniel, we see Nebuchadnezzar have a giant golden statue built of him and made everybody come together and bow and worship down to his image. And if you weren't, you were going to be thrown into a fiery furnace. That didn't exactly go down how Nebuchadnezzar thought, but that's a story for another time. Nebuchadnezzar was also very big on having his dreams read. And maybe because he thought maybe he could use that knowledge and control his future, maybe he was trying to cope with things in his mind and get better control over them, or maybe he just wanted his dreams interpreted because himself was his favorite subject at all time. But either way, there's this one young Jewish man named Daniel. He was in Nebuchadnezzar's court, and he was taken as a young man during the exile. He was talented, he was smart, and he worked his way up in Nebuchadnezzar's court, and he was very gifted by God with the talent to interpret dreams. In Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has a very, very bizarre dream. And he goes to Daniel to have that interpreted because Daniel has been very reliable. Daniel reads it, that the king needs to renounce his sins. He needs to change his life. He needs to do what's right because otherwise God's going to humble him. God's going to give him over to insanity. He's going to act like he's an animal, like an ox, and be eating grass in a field. Not for a day, not for a month, but for 7 years. The Bible tells us that a whole year passed by from that instance. But the king didn't change. And one day King Nebuchadnezzar was standing up, looking over all his kingdom and admiring everything that he did and all that he accomplished. And he boasted about it. And that's when the dream was fulfilled. Daniel chapter 4:33. Someone want to read?
Immediately what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like the ox. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird.
Now I can only imagine how confusing and how terrifying this would have been for Nebuchadnezzar, but also for all the people that surrounded him as well. This is a man of stature, of power, a man who was cunning and shrewd enough to take his nation of Babylon to a superpower status. The man who conquered the Middle East and gave the nation of Egypt a run for their money. This was a man who felt invincible. He exalted himself, he idolized himself, and now he's chewing grass. His dignity is taken away. The next verses go on to say that at the end of that time period, he looked up to heaven and his sanity was restored. That fog was lifted, and he was now himself once again. And he started to give credit where credit was due. He started praising God and giving him glory. And in Daniel chapter 4:36 through 37, someone?
At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne, and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble.
Nebuchadnezzar looked up to God. He was restored. He was given his life back, and he was made greater than what he was before. Now this is an example of mental illness that was given to a king to humble his ego and help him realize he was truly in power. And sometimes our afflictions, whether they are physical or mental or emotional, are there to humble us. Sometimes our trials will put us down a peg or two because we've lost that reliance on him, and we need to be reminded of it. Other times our afflictions are a result of our own decisions. We can put ourselves in a situation where we have to deal with our own mess. I think about the prophet Jonah, who ran from what God gave him because he didn't think it was right. He turned around, he went the opposite direction. He was swallowed up by a giant fish, and he had to sit in the belly of that fish for 3 days thinking about it before God put him on the right track again. So sometimes we bring the issues on ourselves. Sometimes our afflictions happen due to something that's completely out of our control. Sometimes it's a traumatic event that completely changes our lives. Sometimes these conditions, we're born with them. But no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the condition, God is there with us. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord who heals, the Lord who restores. For myself, I believe that one day God's going to restore my legs. He's going to restore my back. He's going to restore my hips. He's going to restore my ankles, either on this side of heaven or the next. He restored my life from alcoholism. He gave that back to me. He healed those wounds that nobody can see. And I believe that he's not done yet. Just like I believe that he's not done with any of you in here. Just like Nebuchadnezzar, one day you're going to look up to heaven. You're going to be restored fully. And one day you're going to be made greater than you were before. I believe that for myself. I believe it for every single person in this room. And as Christians, we need to hold tight to that faith and lean on it. But man, is it easy to feel all alone in situations, right? Sometimes our needs that need to be healed, they're emotional. Sometimes the event or circumstance in our life really scarred us deeply, and it can make us feel isolated. This could be the loss of a loved one. It could be a bout of depression due to dreading the circumstances surrounding us, or it could even just be a stressful event happening right now in our lives that we feel overwhelmed at and we have a hard time coping with. In the book of Ruth, we meet a woman. Her name is Naomi, and in a very short period of time, she lost her husband and she lost both of her sons. She was left poor, destitute, with nobody to take care of her. Naomi is so broken that people don't even recognize her anymore. And she renames herself Mara, which we studied means bitter. Ruth 1:21. She says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. Her daughter-in-laws try to help her, but she tries to push them away so they don't fall in that same pit as her. She didn't want to drag them down. She wanted them to have something better than what she'll have in her life. But her daughter-in-law, Ruth, decides to stay with her. And through circumstances that only God's divine hand can change in her situation, a man named Boaz meets Ruth. He falls in love with her. He ends up marrying Ruth and reclaiming land for Naomi and Ruth that they would have otherwise lost. This was a giant turnaround that happened in their lives. The best thing that happens is that Boaz and Ruth have a baby. And in the end of the book of Ruth, we see that Naomi is holding this baby in her arms and caring for her. And I can tell you from experience, and Crystal can tell you too, that it doesn't matter how bad your day is. You put that tiny little grandbaby in your arms, your heart melts.
Yep.
And everything's all right in the world again.
You think your kids do that? No. It's the grandbabies.
Because you can give them back.
Yes, exactly.
But this is a transformation in Naomi. She's not bitter anymore. She's not going to be known as Mara anymore because she's going to be known as a different name, Grandma. You know, she's not alone anymore. She's not focused on the things that's been taken away, but now she could focus on the blessings that God is giving her. Now, Naomi, she had a very, very tragic wound, right? And that took a very long time for her to even try to start to heal. And that's very understandable given her situation. But sometimes our trauma, sometimes our situations, sometimes our emotions don't take a long time to process. Sometimes it's a roller coaster ride. Sometimes those events happen very quickly back to back. When I think of an emotional roller coaster, I look at the first book of Kings where we meet a prophet named Elijah. He came to Israel during the time of King Ahab, where he took a pagan wife, queen named Jezebel. But instead of worshiping God, they turned the nation to worship a pagan god named Baal. They attempted to turn all the people away from God, and Elijah performed some amazing miracles through his ministry to try to turn people back to God. Arguably, Elijah's most famous one was the showdown at Mount Carmel. You may be familiar with this one, but this is where Elijah challenges 450 prophets of Baal to a sacrifice showdown. Each of them was to prepare their respective altars, their respective sacrifices. However, it was going to be up to God to light the flame. either Baal or God. All day the prophets of Baal shouted, they danced, they cried out, they even harmed themselves to plead for Baal to show up. All day they were doing this, all day Elijah taunted them. Then Elijah got up, he poured water on the sacrifice 3 times, just to up the level of challenge. Then he prayed to God. He prayed to God to show up and turn the hearts of the people back to him. And then God's fire consumed it all. At this point, Elijah was probably feeling really good, right? God just showed up in a very powerful way in his life. He probably thought that this was going to be a complete game changer, that the hearts of everybody is now going to be turned around. It's now going to be opened up to God. It's now going to be restored. In his mind, he said, if this is it, if this isn't it, I really don't know what is. If this doesn't change the situation, what will? But instead, this was just a roller coaster going up the hill. Because Jezebel didn't change her heart. Instead of changing her ways, she wanted him dead. She wanted to put a stop to it, and she was willing to put all the resources that came into it. This is where the roller coaster starts to go down for Elijah. 1 Kings 19, 3 through 4.
Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors.
Had enough, Lord. I'm done with this. Take my life. Begging for the Lord to take his life. He went from an emotional high to now fleeing in fear for his life. He's now on a run, feeling hopeless, feeling despair, and even feeling suicidal. Elijah felt like he was all alone in this. Like Israel felt so far away from God that, in my opinion, he also kind of feels responsible for this. Because he thought he would be the one who would have to change their hearts. He's thinking, what's the point of going on anymore? I completely failed. I completely let everybody down. What happens next is that God gave him rest. God gave him food, and God gave him encouragement. God tells Elijah where to go in his next step, to find Elisha, who's going to take up the reins as a prophet behind him. He's giving Elijah his purpose. God tells Elijah that he's not alone in this either. God tells him he has 7,000 other prophets on reserve, just like him in Israel, to take back that worship from Baal. He's telling Elijah that this was never in your hands. This was always in my hands. And this has always been under control. Have you ever been in a situation like that? A situation where, yeah, it's bad, but then you kind of chew it over in your mind and you mentally make this situation 1,000 times worse for yourself than what it is in reality. Elijah, yeah, he was in a bad situation. He was Israel's most wanted. But he made it worse by thinking that he's all alone in this. God gave Elijah a break. He made him step away from it. He gave him a recovery time. It was actually a period of 40 days. And during that time, God was tending to him. God was giving him time to regroup, start self-caring for himself. And sometimes God just gives us that period of recovery too, that period of rest, that reset that we so desperately need, that healing touch for our soul before we're ready for that next leg of the journey. He gives us that moment between the roller coaster rides, between the peaks and the valleys, where we can actually sit back and enjoy that view for a couple minutes before we have to get to our next journey. Now, sometimes it's that roller coaster ride, but sometimes we just need that healing touch in our day-to-day life. Sometimes we have a very stressful situation that just flares up, then it's gone. But even in the big and the small, we still need God, not just through the peaks and the valleys, but also through the speed bumps in life. When I think about a very stressful situation that popped up and pressure that just completely overwhelmed somebody, I go to the Gospel of Luke, and at the end of chapter 10, we meet a pair of sisters called Martha and Mary. Jesus and his disciples are in town, and Martha opens up her home to welcome them. Martha puts this huge pressure and burden on her shoulders because this is a big deal to her to be that perfect host for the Messiah. She's trying to do everything she can because this is very important to her. She's running around like crazy. I can imagine preparing this to try to make Thanksgiving dinner on the fly with only about an hour notice. So she's running around, she's stressing, trying to make this all perfect, and her sister's just sitting there. It's making her lose her mind. Eventually, she brings it up to Jesus. She says something to her. She says, Lord, can you help? Can you talk to her? Jesus does help. He gives her help. He gives her advice, but it's not the way she expected. Luke 10:40 through 42. Someone?
But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had to be made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her.
Now there's two types of people, and I can tell you, I'm a Martha. I stress. I put undue pressure on myself. I can take that situation, I can chew it over in my mind until I wear myself out with it. Jesus tells us to just focus on Him. Don't focus on the stress. Don't focus on all the things you need to do. Don't focus on trying to perform at a very high level. Just focus on me. Focus at sitting on my feet. Focus on listening. Focus on watching. Focus on spending time there. And it's a far better position to be. We think that we have to run around and do all these things and perform. God has it all. He doesn't need us. He just wants us. And we just got to be reminded of that. We got to be reminded that all He wants sometimes is just for us to sit at His feet. I'm reminded in Matthew 11:28 through 29, where Jesus tells us, come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. We need to take those burdens off of our shoulders. We need to stop acting like we're the only ones that can pull ourselves out of that situation. We have to stop acting like our power is enough, because there is only one power that's enough. A power that can heal any and all things. Our body, our mind, our heart, our souls. He can do it all. He died on the cross for all of it. We think it's just for the forgiveness of sins and for our salvation of our souls. But He bought all of us. Every single part. Jevoah Rapha, the Lord who heals. We're going to end tonight with a little bit of a reflection. These examples that we looked at tonight, the pool of Bethesda, King Nebuchadnezzar, Ruth, Elijah, these are people who took the focus off of God, put the focus on themselves instead of putting the focus on God. They were not alone, they were not forsaken in their problems, but rather they were being carried through them by God. They may not have realized it at the time that God had them in their hands, and they may have been carried while they were kicking and screaming the whole time. But let's be honest, sometimes we do the same thing. But let's take those burdens off of ourselves. Let's open ourselves up to Him. Let's let ourselves be carried by Him. Let's surrender ourselves. Let's find some rest tonight, and let it be our first step towards healing where we need it the most. Because He's able. He will. Let's let ourselves be healed by Him. So we're going to enter into this time of worship and prayer, and just let those last words from Jesus meditate into our mind and spirit. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened,